when a team member leaves the company, the rest of the team has to pick up those duties. Some companies sound like they have an unofficial practice. So Brittleigh, why don't you tell us a little bit about this topic, and then let's talk about some of the pros and cons about it.
Absolutely. So yeah, an unofficial practice is currently happening with one of my clients who has some turnover happening. And so when somebody has left a team, they're choosing to give their employees a temporary raise. So someone may be taking on additional work, or they may be just simply one less team member. And so the company has decided, well, we'll just go ahead, give the temporary raise. That raise will be reduced once we bring on a second team member. So we've discussed a lot about how to do this properly, the downsides, the dangers. There are some, as well as the compliance pieces. And are there other things that maybe we could be doing rather than a wage increase? So ultimately, I think the first thing to discuss with this would be how to do it properly, if that's truly what we're going to be doing. Sommer, do you have any thoughts about where to start to properly give somebody a temporary wage increase?
Oh my, well, Brittleigh, I have a lot of thoughts on some of the downsides, but as you mentioned, it absolutely can be done if the organization believes that that's the right approach to them. And I think first and foremost, it's important that not only our conversations with the team member or team members who are assuming this additional work and receiving compensation for it, sat down and very clearly communicated what this looks like and what it doesn't look like, but that those conversations are also documented in writing that the employee signs. So what I mean by this is that I would suggest that the HR team provides a letter notifying the team member that beginning on X date, that they will be temporarily increased from whatever their current rate is to the proposed rate for either a predetermined amount of time until the position is filled, or as determined by management, right? Because there needs to be some flexibility in there that if at any point management decides, hey, this isn't working, there's no promise that it has to continue through a certain date. And then I would have the employees sign it and place it in their file. And I think you'd be good to go.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I think if we're doing this, the correct way to do it is document, document, document. So we want to make sure that the employee is very clear, that they understand not just when this starts, but especially when it ends. So what about the downsides and dangers of doing something like a temporary increase in wage?
Well, I have one. I'd be curious your thoughts on this as well. I think the potential downside is that when you have somebody performing a job and you're paying them more for it, at some point you'll have to bring them back down to their prior wage. And I know there'd be a lot of excitement to making more money, but just as there's a lot of excitement, I think that there is a bit of a letdown, even if it's communicated and expected. And then the other downside I see just being, depending on how long this employee or employees have been performing in this elevated capacity, they may at the end of that time frame wonder, well, if I was good enough to fill in for this job, then why am I not good enough to stay in this job? And I think that's a valid question. But Brittleigh, what are some downsides or dangers that come to your mind?
Sure, I agree with that one entirely. I think that the morale of the employee who would have that increase and then decrease rather would definitely be something that we should be mindful of. Another danger here or risk would be the compliance piece. So depending on what state you might be listening to or listening in from, there are certain compliance pieces around decreasing wage. And a lot of those are notice requirements. And so you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Brittleigh, we've already done the appropriate documentation because you told us we had to document. So we notified them. True, but your state may require that you notify them within a certain amount of time. Maybe it's 5 days prior, maybe it's 2 weeks prior, but you'd want to have that notice again. Why, you ask? Well, we don't want to at any point have red flags because nobody wants to have to deal with an audit. And if there is an audit that just walks in and says that it's time, that lovely day that can occur from time to time, you want to have it documented, not just the conversation and not just the start and end date, but in compliance with the particular state that you are working within, even if it feels like it's over documentation. And I call that a downside or a danger, not because compliance is a downside. I'm a compliance nerd. I love it. But lots of people don't like it, and lots of people don't want to be a compliance nerd. And so these steps can get missed. And when they get missed, compliance problems turn into audit problems, turn into more documentation later. And so if we're going to do this, there's just so many different steps that I wonder, is there a better way? Is there a better way to show an employee whose team member has left that they might be left with some of their work, that they're appreciated? Maybe it's even in form of compensation of some sort, Summer?
Yeah, I think you mentioned, the downside or the danger being the compliance aspect. And there's definitely a few more things I wanted to dive into here, because if you're an HR administrator or a small business owner, and maybe this is a practice that you've done or you might consider doing, there is a lot to take into account. And you definitely don't want to mess it up, because if the overarching goal of doing this is for the benefit of the company and the benefit of the team member, being able to work on some stretch projects and increase their pay, you definitely don't want a problem to come out of it. And one of the items that comes to mind is the potential for inequity. And what I mean by this is, within a company, how do you justify to employees that you might do this for somebody who has left the company and the team assumes their extra work, but you don't do it for a layoff? Or maybe you don't do it when there's a leave of absence or extended vacations. And ultimately, the question becomes, where do you draw the line? And even if it's not an unofficial practice, I think it becomes problematic, because if you start doing it, people will talk. And how do how do you stop doing it? And if you decide to do it for some and not the others, you have the morale issues. And then, ultimately what was meant to be a good thing is no longer a good thing. So you can see how it becomes messy pretty quick. But Brittleigh, I'm curious if you have ideas for our listeners on, if they were going to do this. We talked about how to do it properly, but are there other ways that you can think of companies thinking about this differently on other approaches they might want to take?
Absolutely. So I think it's interesting, the idea of when to stop, because you're right, vacations and layoffs and terminations, for that matter, and turnover, this could also get very expensive. So I think a different way to look at it is the potential for a bonus for someone on a team that has maybe lost somebody to a different offer or another company, who's gone above and beyond during that time. So we're not just giving an increase because of what another employee has decided they're going to do, but in fact rewarding an employee for what they've done when that has happened. Because ultimately, turnover is inevitable. Teams are going to not be fully staffed from time to time. So rather than just saying we're going to fill the void with an increase every time this happens, and oh goodness, that might get really expensive really quick, I think looking and evaluating individual employees on teams who have team members who have left for whatever reason and saying, this individual went above and beyond, they took on extra, they had a smile on their face, they rallied the team, maybe considering those for bonuses after the fact, after we've been able to evaluate and see really, does this make sense to increase?
I like that idea a lot. And I think that that is, of the two, actually a better solution, because I do worry that if we are increasing the pay of an individual immediately, we don't know how they're going to perform in the job. And so how long do we continue to pay them to maybe just limp along and just barely get by? Whereas if you take the bonus approach, then there is no promise to them up front. There's no expectation. And it would only truly be justifiable if that team member performed at an acceptable level. And I've seen companies do this through their bonus programs, like a spot bonus program. And the way that some companies have budgeted for it is to say, hey, each department has an allocated budget for spot bonuses each quarter, and it's up to the manager to determine what employees may have done to warrant that spot bonus. And so if the manager decides that they want to give it out for somebody who put in extra hours or saved the company money or filled in when there was a gap on the team, then there's that discretion. There isn't that expectation. And I think it's just a much more sustainable model because using the one that we initially discussed, I think kind of sets that expectation that it's going to happen. And I feel like that's part of the biggest danger all around.
Absolutely, I agree.
Well, it's been wonderful chatting about these two topics on today's show. And Brittleigh, I'm curious to know, is there anything else you wanted to share about our Consultants Corner topic before we wrap up our show today?
Actually, Summer, I thought it would be really interesting, real quick, to bring up the idea that Joey actually had about this particular topic. And that was just one last piece to consider if you're still thinking about that wage increase and that temporary wage increase. What happens if the individual you gave it to leaves the company when they have that increase? We would then have to dig in and look, do we need to pay out any PTO that's available to them for payout at that increased rate? Is it the old rate? Did we discuss that in the documentation and could just, again, have another issue? So this is something we workshopped, and I think that Joey's insight was really important. And in his absence, I thought it was interesting to bring up and make sure that everybody's aware. There's so many different avenues that you'd have to think in regard to this particular topic, including what happens if the person leaves.
Wow, that is a really great point. And I'm glad that you mentioned it, because when companies are making these decisions, I think sometimes it's really quick on the surface for this, and this is a great example, for there just to be a really, what seems like an easy solution. We'll just pay them more, right? Just pay them more till we get somebody in the position. It's super easy, right? And at the end of the day, it's not.